Hello, and thank you for joining me. It's very nice to see many of you today, and I am Dr. Andy Franklin Miller. I am Chief Medical Officer for Neuritas. Neuritas, if you are not aware, is a biotech company really focused on transforming the health of the world using peptides. Now, I would say that because that's what we're going to talk about. And so what I'm going to do here is share some slides. We're going to talk now about whether peptides are purely the preserve of the pharmaceutical companies. Feel free to jump in with any questions, either directly to me via LinkedIn or indeed in the chat. But first of all, what is a peptide? Well, look, a peptide is a small chain of amino acids. It's a protein, typically under 50 amino acids. And typically not under 5 or lower. And these have a very defined role in the body. And we're going to talk a little bit about where pharma have gone with those. But they primarily act as signaling molecules. And that means they bind to a receptor, which may up or down regulate a process. And therefore, they're very prone to be able to manipulate our body's activities and therefore exciting for pharma. Indeed, they are really much the rising star. There was a $28.5 billion market in 2018, and that's predicted to rise to $117 billion by 2034. There's surprisingly few out there. Over 80 peptide drugs have been developed globally, only, not over. And 31 of those have been discovered in the last 7 years. And there are a number of reasons for that, particularly in the manipulation of peptides. Typically, peptides have a very short half-life. So they absorb, they break down, they act very quickly. And so pharma have been working very hard to work on something like PEG glycylation, whereby you can defend the peptide by encapsulating it to protect it and preserve its penetration, and also in N-alkylation in order to cell membrane penetration and half-life. The probably most famous example in recent years is semaglutide or Ozempic, and that reached $12 billion in sales in 2023. But we're starting to see exploratory work in both cancer. We can see Pluvicto there, radionucleotide peptide receptor in prostate cancer, but also in neurodegenerative diseases, myasthenia gravis, and also in cancers in melanoma. So certainly the environment is good and healthy for looking for these. And why peptides? Well, they're very specific with very low toxicity. They break down quite quickly and very low immunogenicity. So good candidates. And sticking on that pharma theme, particularly in the US, peptides are very much the compounding pharmacist's dream. It's a limited market, 12 billion or so in 2023, and they're sold off license where these peptides aren't patented or sold as personalization. So a physician will prescribe these. They'll be made up in a compounding pharmacist and then prescribed. The most famous is BPC 157, and its really popularity came in and around biohacking. It's supposed to do a whole wealth of things, but the lack of human studies puts it in FDA category 2, which is significant safety risk. It's not approved for human use, and these are used off license. And you can see why there on the top right-hand corner. Ipamorelin is a growth hormone-releasing peptide, typically would be prescribed by a physician for very specific reasons, and is the darling of regenerative and longevity medicine. It's an anabolic steroid precursor. It's FDA restricted because of serious side effects. And as a result, WADA, so the World Anti-Doping Authority, have a class of banned substances. And peptides sit within this class. Now, very specifically, peptides working on anabolic pathways, on vascular endothelial releasing hormone, and a number of categories. But these sit very firmly. These are synthetic peptides. They're prescription peptides, and therefore they are banned under the S2 class. But we hear this word food is medicine incredibly commonly. And you know, do we really mean that? We know that obesity rates in the US in particular, over 40% of US adults are obese, partly due to their diet. We know that trans-saturated fat contribute nearly 1 million deaths a year in the US in heart disease. and that sugar in carbonated beverages can cause 26% increases in type 2 diabetes. And it goes on. Mental health, high sugar diets responsible for 23% increase in depression. So can we really talk about food as medicine, given the ingredients within the food space? Well, ingredients are difficult to come by because of a high failure rate. If we look at new ingredients reaching the market, 80 to 90% fail to reach commercialization because of multiple failures. Either they don't work, they're not absorbed, they don't deliver the benefit that they are expected, and most of these are in taste and texture and preservative and stability. And development costs can be up to 50 million with scaling. So incredibly expensive. And when we think about the cost in use of ingredients, these can't be expensive because our finished good is incredibly sensitive to increases in price. It's also a very long process. So 12 years down the line to fail at 90% of new ingredient identification is a significant problem. And that's what takes us to whether or not we can do something a little differently. So at Neuritas, we've explored the plant kingdom. We've looked for peptides that exist within plants. And not just any plant, food-grade plants. So we've looked to see whether or not we can identify peptides that are hidden within the ecosystem. Dr. Nora Caldy founded Neuritas over 10 years ago, and actually the aim of that process of identification was to try to reduce some of the bias. So when a biologist describes an experiment, they do it very differently from a mathematician. When we look at proteomics in mass spectroscopy, the output of that is very different to that we might see in a graphical form of a pie chart. And so at Neuritas, our goal has been to codify the language of science, to take the peptides that we identify, how we unlock them, how we hydrolyze them, and the various parameters and assays that they work on, and develop a code with which that works in and around. What that enables us to do is to take away potential bias. And therefore, we can develop an AI platform called Magnifier, which enables us to match potential sources of peptides and how to access them with the potential efficacy. And so what we're really being able to do here is we're trying to de-risk that process via a large neural network type decision-making tree, which gives us the ability to successfully identify those ingredients. And if we go back to that plant, does that mean we can find novelty and novel ingredients from that plant kingdom? So if we look at muscle, sorry for 1 second there. If we look at muscle and we consider how the various pathways that affect muscle, there's an area of protein synthesis, how we create new muscle. And muscle is one of the largest endocrine organs in the body, and therefore the production of energy, muscular energy, the ability to run up and down the stairs, to get in and out of a chair, to stand, to sit, is incredibly important. And that comes from muscle too. And again, that large endocrine organ, it's the site of uptake of most of the glucose in the body. And so countering inflammation in our blood vessels and embedding that glucose up into muscle is incredibly important. And as we age, as we get over 40, every year we lose 1% of muscle mass unless we do something about it. So muscle is a really interesting target for a food ingredient which can both impact health and longevity. A recent systematic review and meta-analysis in the British Journal of Sports Medicine highlights that muscle mass and muscle power contributes 17% to all-cause mortality. That's a potential risk reduction in deaths by cardiovascular disease, by metabolic disease, neurodegenerative, and all-cause cancers. So significantly important. What we can see here is the mTOR pathway, the muscle protein synthesis pathway in the body. Typically, leucine and arginine, two amino acids, bind at cestrin-2 and castor at the top of that pathway and trigger that protein synthesis pathway. PeptiStrong, a Neuritas peptide ingredient, acts at the ribosomal S6 level at the bottom of that pathway to upregulate protein synthesis within the muscle. But the ingredient PeptiStrong contains more than one cluster of peptides. So that first cluster will work around the S6 upregulation of protein synthesis. But the second cluster works at mitochondrial ATP to increase energy production. And we know creatine monohydrate works very well in this aspect. It's a well-accepted food supplement, at 5 grams per day, shows significant increases in muscle power. PeptiStrong complements that, so works in a different way, the peptides, to upregulate ATP at the mitochondrial level and increase power. And we'll see that in some of the clinical trial results shortly. We're not done yet, though, because there are 2 other clusters of peptides within that PeptiStrong group. A cluster that works on removing inflammation, and a cluster that works via gene transcription to work against MRF1 and estrogen-1, preventing muscle breakdown. And PeptiStrong is an entirely natural ingredient. It comes from a fava bean, so fava bean protein, and is hydrolyzed to an ingredient which is a white powder, which can be incorporated in multiple end user states. To date, we have 3 human clinical trials, and I'll spend just 10 minutes talking through these. The first 2 trials were in male subjects, and you can see first conducted by Professor Luc van Loon in Maastricht University, male subjects 18 to 35. You see myself in the second study, and this was before I joined Neurotas. Again, here this was male subjects, a little older, 30 to 45, and trained athletes in this circumstance. And then a third study in men and women, 19 to 40 years old, untrained athletes, or the general population. So let's dive in and talk about these studies a little bit more. The first study, Luc van Loon. Here we took 30 men. We immobilized them in plaster of Paris. So we simulated muscle injury. We covered the leg in plaster from ankle to hip and allowed the muscle to decrease in size. What we also saw was a decrease in strength, and you can see that in the bottom right-hand corner. The graph at baseline, both the PeptiStrong group and the control group both decreased in strength after the immobilization. But here we compared milk protein, 20 grams, versus PeptiStrong. And in that bottom right-hand graph, you see again that after 2 weeks of the cast being removed, the PeptiStrong group had regained their original leg strength, whilst the milk protein group still was struggling to regain about 60% of that strength. Now, when we took muscle biopsy of the limbs, we saw the PeptiStrong group, the FSR, or protein synthesis rate, was 4 times greater in the PeptiStrong group than in the milk protein group. And on the left-hand side, again, we see that the PeptiStrong group did better in terms of muscle recovery. So here we see that we can simulate muscle damage, and we can increase the rate of recovery and increase muscle strength. In the second study, we really wanted to look at recovery. And what we did was induce muscle damage via a repeated measures leg extension test. So we put our subjects into a leg extension machine and caused eccentric, concentric, and isometric hold damage to the muscle. And then we followed them up 2 days and 3 days later, where we put them through a leg strength test to see how much strength they'd recovered. Here we compared PeptiStrong to placebo capsules. When we look at the top left-hand graph, again, we can see at 48 hours after that induction of injury, we see a decrease in the delta of strength. But at 72 hours, we see a significant difference between PeptiStrong and placebo, where the PeptiStrong group is recovering that strength beyond that of baseline. And when we look at the right-hand side on something called fatigue index, so the best way to imagine fatigue index is muscular energy. So how much weight you can lift at the first rep versus how much weight you can lift at the end rep. So the fatigue fade. What we can see is almost doubling of that energy capacity in the PeptiStrong group with 47% less fatigue. So the PeptiStrong group were able to lift the same weight at the same power for longer. And we also saw some suppression of myokines, so some reduction in the inflammatory aspect in and around muscle injury. So we looked at strength recovery there. And in our third study, let me take a little bit longer here to explain how that third study worked. So here we took 60 subjects, men and women. We started with 72, but had some dropouts. And you'll understand why. This was not a trained group. These weren't regular gym goers. And what we had done is we put them into the gym for the first time, 3 times a week, lifting some weights. And it was a progressive program. So when they could lift the number of repetitions, we asked them to increase the weight. They were matched for protein intake. So we could have a look and check that they were roughly around 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is a sort of standard intake of protein, and certainly, and there was no difference between the two groups. What we saw across 2 months of training was a 17% difference in strength increase in favor of PeptiStrong over placebo. So the PeptiStrong group got stronger faster than the other group. And when we looked at that muscular energy effect again, what we were able to see was an increase in muscular endurance, or the number of reps completed. Now, this was in a gym, but would translate well to something like a sit-to-stand test in an older population, where the number of reps, the number of times we can get in and out of a chair, or the number of times we can get up a staircase would increase. We also looked at perceived quality of life, because one of the very telling signs here was a feeling of energy. And we saw significant differences in perceived health and in energy. One of the incidental findings that we also didn't expect to see, but we measured bone mineral content as part of a DEXA scan, and we saw a 0.7% increase in that bone mineral content. It was a secondary observation. We didn't expect to see it, and as such, we certainly wouldn't want to draw too many conclusions from it at this stage, but it's an area where we might look for further research. So in summary at this point, I want to say peptides are not just drugs. AI has enabled us to accelerate that discovery chain. We can identify peptides from potential food-grade plant sources that we can access via oral intake, which has given us a paradigm shift. We can now truly say food can become medicine, because we can work in any vertical category of non-communicable disease. We can work in areas of glucose modulation. We can work in areas of sleep and recovery, of brain health. We can look at gut interactions with probiotics, the gut-brain axis. We can look at menopausal symptoms and identify ingredients with positive health benefits that can develop a paradigm shift within the industry. So I'm going to stop there and just see if there are any questions at this point. Mark, lovely to see you. And you can attest, I know, to that increase in energy. And it's one of the really interesting things that I think comes about with PeptiStrong is that that feeling of energy, the get up and go, the willingness to be able to get those daily tasks done. And that's certainly not an effect of mTOR. That's an effect of the mitochondrial upregulation of ATP, that feeling of energy. And we've got some very recent data that we're about to share next week with our sales team on the immediate effects on jump height in professional athletes, whereby PeptiStrong is giving a significant increase in muscular power. And by power, we mean the rate of force development, how much we can shove a box off a desk, how we can pick the shopping up out of the car, how we can run up a flight of stairs. And so that's an incredibly powerful tool. And one that we can think of in formulation. And it's a great question there in terms of why muscle health. And I think the focus there has very much been on longevity. It's an interesting area of space that, muscle health, very small changes in muscle health can lead us into a space where we can make positive health benefits. And it's a difficult area. We know that some brands are very much focused on increasing the amount of protein in that brand and chasing a headline number of 20, 30, 40 grams. What PeptiStrong is focused on doing is getting more out of that protein. So can we activate more pathway process? Can we double your energy? Can we double your recovery? Can you get more out of that protein and maximize its benefits? That's exactly what this ingredient can do. And it's a small dose, 2.4 grams a day. And certainly we've seen in some formulations that's divided across applications. It could be 2 yogurts a day at different times, or it could be into a milk-based shake in the morning or after the gym. And peptides work quickly, but the effects, as you've seen, are consistent over both 2 months and is short as immediate. Awesome. So thank you for joining that very first live stream. I still some teething problems in terms of actually how we get this to work, but it'll be recorded and we'll post it up. Thanks again.